The Knights Templar, a notorious holy order of elite warriors from the 12th century who answered to no one but the Pope himself, and who later on would lay the foundation for today's modern banking system. They were originally known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers or the Poor Knights of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. And as the name implies, they swore an oath to poverty, chastity, and service. According to legend, Hughes, the first Grand Master of the Templars, and Godfrey were so poor that between the two of them they had only one horse. And in theory, this is what gave rise to the famous image on the seal of the Templars, which is two men riding one horse. So how exactly do the Poor Knights of Christ become the most powerful bankers in Europe, and how do they lay the foundation for the modern banking system exactly? In order to answer that question, we must go back to the inception of the order around the year 1118. After Jerusalem was captured by Christian armies during the Crusades, a group of pilgrims from across Western Europe started visiting the Holy Land. The challenge is that many of them, however, were getting robbed and killed when they crossed through Muslim-controlled territories during this journey. So this is why around 1118, a French knight named Hughes de Payens creates a military order along with 8 relatives and acquaintances, calling it the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon. And later on, they become known as just the Knights Templar. With the support of the ruler of Jerusalem, Baldwin II, they set up their headquarters on that city's sacred Temple Mount, the source of their now iconic name. They then pledged to protect Christian visitors to Jerusalem. So this is why the Knights Templar were originally established. They are a holy order of knights in charge of providing safe travels and protection to all these pilgrims coming from Europe to Jerusalem. Initially, the order did receive criticism and pushback from other religious leaders, but in 1129 it received the official endorsement of the Catholic Church. Following this, in 1139, the Templars started receiving some special rights coming from the Pope. At that time, Pope Innocent II issued an order where the Templars were now exempt from having to pay taxes. They were permitted to build their own oratories, and they were held to no one's authority except the Pope's. So this is the point where the Knights Templar become essentially the Pope's personal army. Although the original purpose of the order was to protect pilgrims, their duties were gradually expanded. They became defenders of the Crusader states and the Holy Land, and developed a reputation for being brave, highly skilled warriors that were forbidden from retreating from battle unless faced with overwhelming odds. On top of being soldiers in the Crusades and bodyguards for pilgrims, they eventually also became bankers. The reason for that is because the pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem needed to somehow fund months of food, transport, and accommodations, and carrying massive amounts of gold and silver with them during these travels would just make them a huge target. For this reason, the Templars created a bank in an exchange note system. This basically meant that any pilgrim that was making the trip to Jerusalem, instead of having to travel with all that gold and silver and make themselves a massive target, they could just go to the Templars, deposit their assets, get an exchange note, make the trip to Jerusalem, and once there, request to withdraw their assets using that exchange note with the Templars once again. And this letter of credit was as trustworthy as it can get. That's because of the reputation that the Templars had, the fact that they were backed by the church, they were backed by an actual military force, the actual Catholic Church, and the reputation that they had in general. So one thing that's important to note is that the Templars are not the first organization in history to provide this type of service. Several centuries earlier, the Tang Dynasty in China had a similar system going on. The difference is that this system was operated by the government, whereas the Templars were much closer to a private bank. They were in fact the first to create an international banking system. So being a depository bank and offering letters of credit is not the only type of financial service that the Templars actually provided. They also operated often in the capacity of brokers as well. A good example that we have of this is in the 1200s, King Henry III of England, he wanted to buy an island, the island of Oleron. So the Templars are the ones who actually brokered the deal. Henry III paid a certain amount of gold every single year directly to the temple, and once his men took possession of the island, the Templars made sure that the seller actually got paid. So not only did they broker these deals, but they actually also enforced them. Another famous example that we can use is also in the 1200s, when the crown jewels were kept at the temple as a security or collateral on a loan. So the Templars would even be operating in the capacity of a very high-end pawnbroker. What started as a small banking operation eventually covered a huge part of Europe. And over time, the Templars developed a close association with several monarchs. They served as financial managers and treasurers for the kings of France, England, Scotland, Ireland, and many other kingdoms. In fact, even the French treasury was housed with the Templars in Paris at that time. Another interesting fact is that due to their close association with kings, the Templars were entrusted with the responsibility of collecting taxes from the public. When the Saladin tax was levied in England after the capture of Jerusalem by Saladin, it was the Templars who collected the tax from every household in England. Because of their wide array of knowledge, the Templars were even asked at one point to serve as accountants by many kings. Whenever a king or a bishop had a reason to doubt someone's accounts, they would ask a Templar to audit the accounts. Oftentimes, the Templars are only associated with creating that letter of credit system we discussed earlier in the video. But the reality is they provided a wide array of financial services. Ranging from safekeeping, accounting, collection, and distribution of funds, the Templars brokered financial deals and facilitated the buying and selling of various assets. So how does the story of the Templars end? Well, in the late 12th century, the Muslim armies retook Jerusalem and they turned the tides of the Crusades. This forced the Templars to have to relocate several times. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the destruction of the last remaining Crusader refuge in the Holy Land. Over time, European support for the military campaigns in the Holy Land began to erode. Many secular and religious leaders became increasingly critical of the Templars' wealth and power, and by 1303, the Knights Templar lost the last foothold in the Muslim world and established a base of operations in Paris. What follows next is King Philip IV of France decided to bring down the order. There's speculation as to why he did that, but we're not entirely sure. One of the main suggested theories is that the king had a lot of debt, and the Templars denied him additional loans. Many of the knights were brutally tortured until they confessed to false charges, including hearsay, homosexuality, financial corruption, devil worshipping, fraud, and spitting on the cross, and much more. A few years later, dozens of Templars were burned at the stake in Paris for their confessions. De Molay, the Grand Master of the Order, was executed on year 1314. Under pressure from King Philip, Pope Clement V reluctantly dissolved the Knights Templar in year 1312. Then the order's property and monetary assets were given to a rival order. However, it is speculated by some that King Philip and King Edward II of England seized most of the Knights Templar's wealth. The Catholic Church has acknowledged that the persecution of the Knights Templar was unjustified. The Church claims that Pope Clement was pressured by secular rulers to destroy the order. While most historians agree that the Knights Templar fully disbanded 700 years ago, there are some people who believe the order went underground and remains in existence in some form to this day. In the 18th century, some groups, most notably the Freemasons, revived several of the medieval knight symbols, rituals, and traditions. What's interesting is that the Templars ended up creating what we now know as a private banking system, where they were creating and essentially printing out their own currency. This was later expanded on by the great merchant houses of Europe, which created a network of bankers across the continent. But also, this is how what we now know as the modern credit score would be created as well. They created at this time a system where your credit worthiness could be translated from one kingdom to the other. So if you had good credit worthiness with one of the banks in one of the kingdoms, it could now be translated to a place that you had never been before and nobody knew you, which was extremely valuable. Every so often, these bankers would gather and settle their debts. One of these most notable events is the Great Fair of Lyon of 1555. And this was the creation and beginning of private banking, because by turning personal obligations into internationally tradable debts, the medieval banks were essentially creating their own private money outside of the control of Europe's kings. One could also probably say that this is how bankers start becoming more powerful than actual kings and governments. Not only because of the massive amount of wealth that they're generating, but the fact that they broke away from official currency as well and created their own currency that was now tradable and recognized internationally. There are several instances in history we could use to help illustrate this, but a very good example is that of JP Morgan. So JP Morgan is one of the, if not the most important investment banker in US history. He's responsible for bailing out the government and saving the US economy not once but twice. The first instance was in 1895, where JP Morgan arranged loans to the federal government and helped on his own save the US gold standard. The second instance was during the Panic of 1907, where JP Morgan and other Wall Street bankers rescued banks, the stock market, and New York City from financial ruin. This event is what led to what we now know as the US Federal Reserve. The fact that the government owed its economic survival to a private banker forced the necessary legislation to create a central bank and the Federal Reserve. Now, JP Morgan is one of the most interesting characters in US history, and I think he deserves a video of his own. And there's a lot more that I could say about his story. But for the purposes of today's video, that's all that I will mention for now. It just helps show how powerful bankers have become since the medieval ages, since the beginning of the Templars. And this is the story of how the Knights Templar helped lay the foundation for what we now know as modern banking. If you're new to this channel and you enjoyed this video, I highly encourage you to use the playlist feature. I tend to make a wide array and variety of videos that not everybody likes. There are quite a few people that are subscribed to this channel for only very specific types of video that I make. If you're one of those people and you really enjoyed this type of video, the history videos, and you want to see more of them, please use the playlist feature. What I will also say to those people is I'm thinking about starting a history podcast very soon, but more to come in the future. I think I might be putting them on Spotify and Apple as well. But for now, if that's the only type of video that you like, use the playlist feature. You don't have to watch any of my other stuff if you're not into it. You can go ahead and filter and only find the stuff that you want. Because I tend to do a lot of variety content, I work really hard on trying to separate these videos in their own playlists. If you were here with me till the very end, I thank you for your time. If you liked the video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you, and I hope you guys have a great Labor Day weekend.